thought I'd say this, but I think you probably have to split the two issues. Uh, the future for cities, particularly Canadian cities, I think is pretty good. Um, the main driver of urban growth is immigration, and Canadian cities get more immigration on a percentage basis, really, than almost any other city in the developed set of cities in the developed world. So that
Absolutely.
the top five Canadian cities are among the fastest growing cities in the United States and Canada. And Toronto, pretty darn big city, is growing fastest of all on both a percentage and an absolute basis. To the extent that we've already passed Chicago. This is we're talking now urban regional population in population, and we are actually catching up incredibly on Los Angeles, whom we will pass if things go on like this in the early 40s. And at that point, it'll be just us and New York left 1 and 2 on the continent. I mean, this is really quite extraordinary. I've lived in Toronto almost exactly 50 years. And it is one of the most fascinating questions about how did this, frankly, really rather provincial second tier city get to be such a success. And the largest driver was immigration. I think there are some subsidiary drivers there, which we have a very good education system, a really great public education system. And since cities are all about smart people, we're producing more smart people than per capita basis than most other cities are. It's all about universities. University of Toronto is a stellar university. It's always in the top 20 universities in the world. So if cities are about brains, which to an increasing degree they are, then we've got great brain factories here. Should always talk about the community colleges, George Brown, Humber, Centennial, Seneca. These are incredible institutions, and interestingly, they're not that common in other cities. It's common to be so successful. So those are the basic bones of Toronto's success, I think, are set by those sort of fundamental drivers of the city. There are to switch, I guess, reasonably quickly to the transit question. This is where I do have some big problems. Most of the COVID direct impacts, for example, on people not wanting to go into high-rise buildings, not wanting to work in dense office floors, most of these things are going to get fixed slowly. We're going to see office densities significantly lower than they used to be. But the office buildings are there. They're going to get filled. They may get repriced, but they'll get filled. You can see it happening in the housing industry where condo prices are stalled and rents are beginning to drop. And that's just high-rise buildings getting repriced. The challenges on transit, I think, are much more bedrock, and this is why it makes me nervous. Jump in whenever you want to, Brian, on this, but the fundamental problem we've got is that in all the big cities in the world, the rate of car usage is essentially back up where it was. The rate of bus usage is in about a 40-50% of where it was. Subway and heavy rail transit, we're down at about 25 to 30%, depending on which city you're in. So that is not, people are just not comfortable with riding in the subway or riding packed together. And the question is, how long does that reluctance last? And my gut unhappily tells me that it's going to last longer than COVID, that there's going to be a COVID shadow that extends with quite a long tail. And part of the evidence for that is that transit ridership rates were essentially flat going into into COVID. They were flat in New York, they're flat in London, they're flat in Toronto, even slightly declining. What that meant was that potentially people had got fed up with transit. They didn't like it. They didn't like the ride. They didn't like the experience. They prefer to relocate their job or their transit mode to car, a little bit to biking and walking. But as a commuting choice, I worry that potentially we've perhaps passed a rather critical preference line with respect to people's happiness about being jammed together in a tunnel with a hell of a lot of other people.
In your article, Joe, you mentioned a couple of things in regards to pricing that you thought transit agencies should be thinking about to get people to use transit at other times. And then you also commented that people should be giving out Starbucks and Timmy's. Were you serious?
Yeah, I think here's the problem. There are two dominant thought packages about transit. The first one is the engineering one, which the planning profession is a part of, which is build more lines. Here is where we should build them. Here's where the station should be. Very, very physical in its conception. What isn't there particularly is the consumer view of it. So essentially, the public strategy is try and keep transit prices as low as you possibly can, because low price will induce more usage. Well, I'm not so sure anymore. There are lots of cases where low price doesn't induce more usage. I foolishly talked about coffee drinking, but that's clearly a situation where people are paying more on a pretty regular basis for something that they feel has more quality associated with it. And so the real question is, what is the purpose of transit? And if the purpose is to get people downtown, well, look out, because only 2/3 of the people who were working downtown are likely to be working there on a regular basis. So the whole pattern of transit usage is likely to change. And I think we have to treat transit much more as an optional consumer purchase that people will either do or not do. There are a heck of a lot of people who don't have any choices, but there are actually a heck of a lot of people who do have choices. And they are showing us right now, and before COVID, how they want to deploy those choices. So I would sack all the urban planners, and I would sack all the engineers, and I would bring in marketing people. People spend a heck of a lot of money marketing very expensive cars, ridiculous cars that are getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and they do that out of some weird kind of triggering various nervousnesses about car buyers, about security and safety and stuff like that. So that's why SUVs are getting bigger and bigger. Nobody's ever marketed transit. It's sort of like brushing your teeth. You got to do it whether you like it or not. I think we might be at the end of the line of that, and I'm alarmed because I'm a transit fan and I'm an urban density fan, but I think it might, unless we completely rethink the service that we're giving, we might not have the customers that we need, and the economics of transit are so marginal that a 10% reduction in transit usage would kill almost every system in the world.
How do you think transit will change? And it's not just marketing, it's got to be changing the product. To put it in perspective, we actually had a speaker to one of our dinners maybe 2 years ago, who's now a consultant to Metrolinx, say that we don't actually have passenger rail service with Metrolinx, we have freight. Because what we do is we shove a whole bunch of people on a train in Oakville and we ship them down to Union Station where they get off. And we don't actually provide the kind of service, I guess, that you're speaking of.
Yeah. No, I think you're right. I don't have any magic answers here, but one of the things that clearly you can see examples from other transit agencies you will see. I'm a big fan of London Transport and the regional rail system around them, and they have express trains and they have local trains, and the express trains charge more because it gets you there faster, but you still have choice. You can take a local train. They have in some of the lines, not by no means all of them, they have different classes of fare. So you have a first class and you have a second class. When I was growing up, there used to be a third class, amazingly, and in the first class you get a cup of coffee, and it's packed. It's very interesting, especially on longer journeys. Nobody has ever dared to find out in the Toronto transit system or the Toronto Region transit system what people are prepared to pay for premium fares. And what we all know about premium fares in airlines or in railways is that that's where the operator makes their money. So they actually subsidize the back of the bus. Now, there are all kinds of, back of the bus, to use that phrase, and you can see all the trouble that comes up from it. But I think we could be suckering ourselves into a one-size-fits-all that, given that it's going to be under such operating financial stress, is going to get worse and worse and worse. I'm not. I don't know, and I can see an interesting comment here about the premium charge for UP Express. I think that's fair ball. People won't pay a premium. You can see that on the London Heathrow Express, 15-minute journey. The first class in that is empty because people won't pay it for a 15-minute journey. They will for an hour journey, I promise you. So the Hamilton ride, the Oshawa ride, you'd be amazed by who you would divert from the car. And that, just to jump back without overrunning myself here, but I guess if I have a fundamental desire, it is to rid ourselves of the dominance of gasoline-powered vehicles. And that is actually, I think, even more than getting everybody packed into downtown. It's going to be the decarbonization that is the really critical thing to do. And there are a whole bunch of ways we do it, a lot of which have to do with not selling gasoline-powered cars anymore, as they're not doing in Europe as of 2030. But another one of them is to get people out because they can ride in a really interesting, pleasant subway or train experience.
We can come back to transit in a minute, but one of the other fascinating parts of your article was you talked about how office buildings have to change, and you referenced that to actually get everyone in via the elevators in some high-rise office buildings, it would take until after lunchtime.
That's right.
How do you think office buildings in downtown Toronto are going to change?
I think this is something we can be pretty certain about because it's already beginning to happen very, very slowly. And also it's happened in Europe. It may be shutting down now, but certainly for the past couple of months, several European cities have been back at office occupancy. And what you discover is that it's going to be very tough to get over about 2/3 of the previous office occupancy. Because why? You've got to have spatial separation in the office floor. And secondly, you've got the elevator problem, which is not trivial, getting everybody up and down. There's a lot of technology and creativity being piled into elevatoring. And that's actually, I think, a set of systems which are going to go through a huge change over the next little while. They're going to have basically maglev type elevators, sideways running elevators, all kinds of stuff. But the interesting thing is if we're down at 2/3 the occupancy of the actual floor plate of an office building, the population will be roughly what it was 15 years ago. There used to be about 225 square foot per office worker in the high-rise towers. Now there's about 100 square foot per person. So in other words, in the last 15 years, the square foot per person has dropped because we're all working open plan. There are no more offices. We've got hot desks and all that kind of stuff. So I think those kind of trends, which have been pretty severe in cutting office space consumption, are now going to be reversed for a bit. We're going to go back to the last century. But the upshot of that, sorry, is that I think it's going to be very tough for office buildings to have at any one time a population that's anything that's more than about 2/3 of the population they had before COVID.
Do you think that's going to make downtown office building construction less attractive? Will rents go down? Will Oxford and Cadillac Fairview stock prices go down? Will downtown be less dynamic?
I think there's been a bit of that already, but I suspect not, because I think it's going to happen to the stock of high-rise office buildings. The same thing is going to happen everywhere in every city, so there won't be much city comparison. I think there's going to be some loss of primacy of the downtown to satellite centers, and potentially even just an absolute drop in the amount of office space consumed, because we all know we can work from home. Here we are. And what we will see for everybody is, I think, a blended work style where we work 2 or 3 days a week in the office and 2 or 3 days a week at home. So that's going to result in smaller office space consumption. But the buildings are there. It's just like the high-rise apartments are there. They're not going anywhere. So they will get repriced, I suspect. I think that probably the pace. Toronto has been putting office space about 1 million square foot a year. This is more than New York, more than Chicago, more than loads of places. So that might ease a little bit for a while.
So a decade ago, when you were doing work with the Mississauga Summit, you were talking about trying to increase density in nodes around Toronto rather than having the whole focus be downtown Toronto. Is this therefore just actually good because it's going to be an acceleration of a trend that you saw a decade ago?
And actually, what's interesting is that the various reports have suggested that trend of office worker concentration from the central city out to satellite and suburban centers was already happening pre-COVID. So again, the best guide for what's going to be happening post-COVID is what was happening pre-COVID. Toronto was just getting so big and so dense and so congested. Well, there's going to be an effect, which is that people are going to move out. And again, I'm always drawn, if you want to know what's going to happen in Toronto next year, look at what happened in New York and London over the last 10 years. And all of the cities around New York City, like Newark and White Plains and Bridgeport, and etc. These used to be just disaster places, empty of population, and declining. They are putting on office population quite aggressively right now. Same thing is happening in the ring of centers around London. So there'll be a kind of triage, I think, that happens. There'll have to be people who want to be downtown. And then there will be some people who can work successfully from satellite suburban offices. And then there will be a lot of us who will be working all or part of our time from home.
You in your article talked about working from Prince Edward County. I understand that Collingwood and remote places around Toronto are on fire from a real estate standpoint. Yep. Suburban areas around Toronto are in high demand. Could it go even farther than you're suggesting and go to sort of what Tom Friedman talked about 2 decades ago? The world is flat and you can do work from anywhere.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. The world was supposed to be flat 2 decades ago, and in the last 2 decades, it's become incredibly spiky, to use Richard Florida's term. Few cities, the world's top dozen cities, have been on fire for the last 2 decades, and Toronto is lucky enough to be one of those. That fire is going to dampen a bit. I'm not persuaded that Winnipeg or Moncton are going to be the beneficiaries of the decline of the central city. The beneficiaries, I think, are going to be a ring, and it's going to be quite a big ring around Toronto. Kingston will be in it. Peterborough will be in it. Barrie Aurelia are obviously in it. We know about Kitchener-Waterloo, but what about Paris, Ontario? All of these folks are going to be, essentially part of that bigger macro city that's got a kind of visible and invisible wiring.
You have another interesting point I found in your article, and that is that you thought too much of the focus from a city planning and infrastructure and transit standpoint had been on downtown Toronto. And you thought that all the development in the future should be north of the 401, I think is the words that you described it. And you talked about how COVID-19 had unfairly negatively impacted the lower socioeconomic parts of Toronto. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. I mean, when you look at the map and the maps in the globe today, the map hasn't changed for the last 6 months. Where are the places that are most negatively affected? Essentially, they're in the northwest of the city and in the city region. That includes Brampton, and they're in the northeast of the city and areas adjacent to that. And why is that? It's essentially because that's where people who can't work from home, who had to work, go to work on crowded buses, densely packed buses, because they had no other way to go there. Often people had multiple jobs. I had an experience recently of a loved one in the care system. And where did all those care workers came from? I remember because I had all the social insurance numbers in my BlackBerry, and they all came from up north in the Northwest. And they were going to my place, and then they were going to 3 or 4 other places. And where do all the retail workers live? Where do all the construction workers live? Where do all the truckers live? Where do all the people who work in logistics live? These are the folks who actually kept our city going over the last 6 months. And they don't live in the annex, and they don't live in Midtown Toronto, or they don't live in Liberty Village. And so they have been hard done by, to be perfectly honest. And it's really important that we, I think, reverse slightly this enormous emphasis that we've had on the downtown and the waterfront, with a lot of blue ribbon projects that I've been a huge fan of and I've been supporting, absolutely. But they've been going now for 10, 20 years. They ought to be self-supporting. They ought to be generating their own internal investment systems. And where do we need to spend money? The biggest thing is Toronto Community Housing, 115,000 units, and a $2.6 billion maintenance deficit. That's where the people who have suffered most in COVID live. I did it slightly rhetorically, the idea that we just, from now on, the city should only invest north of 401. But if you look at their investment patterns, they have for the last XDX decades been south of 401.
Should transit change north of 401? Do you think that the LRTs that are planned and things like that?
Well, I mean, obviously we've got Finch being built. We've got other things in the works. I think we have to have a very different view of transit, and I would love for Toronto to be a world leader in this, a view of transit in suburban communities. Very little works from a transit point of view in those communities because you don't have the density, and the bus is the standard TTC bus is just too big and too expensive and too inflexible. I would love us to go to a much more imaginative system there, where we almost create a transit franchise managed appropriately by the public sector that invites private delivery. So there's a little bit of, I'm sure you're all familiar, a lot of the folks here today are familiar with the Innisfil experiment with Uber. The pros and cons of that by all accounts, but at least they're experimenting. The notion that you have to have a bus with a very expensive driver that goes on a very inflexible schedule, and frankly picks up very, very few people in a lot of the circumstances, other than on the arterials. I think we should be really throwing it out there and see what we could do. There's some combination of an autonomous vehicle, on-demand transit delivery, a bus vehicle that is in the 10 to 20 passenger range, hopefully without a driver, because the driver is always the most expensive part of bus transit delivery, that can then act as a feeder to the more arterial systems of LRT and subway. But I worry that if we just go on the way we're going, with a potentially macro drop in ridership, we are going to bankrupt the system that we have.
What should government be doing? Do we need federal government, provincial governments putting substantially additional resources into the TTC and go?
Well, I think certainly in the short run, they're going to have to backstop them. There's no question. The amounts of money that are likely to be lost in transit operations are of such significance that no government has, certainly the city government doesn't have the money to do it. I might be talking pie in the sky, but I would like us to start to really innovate, as I said, from a consumer perspective and from an operational perspective on how we deliver transit, particularly in suburban areas. We really haven't moved away from the single delivery system, the single operator of transit, the single fare. We're operating, frankly, a 50s or 60s system in a world in which everything else around us in terms of goods consumption has changed dramatically. Why haven't we looked at that for transit? I was just in one happy year ago, I was in Paris, and I was riding on the one of the principal subway tracks in Paris, the number 1 line that runs along the Seine east-west through the whole city, long line. No driver on the busiest Young Street line in Paris. When you go to London, you discover that certainly pre-COVID, had some problems post-COVID, almost each individual subway line is operated by a different operator under the control of London Transport for London. These are ideas, and certainly the flexible fare system is all over the place in London and Paris and other European cities. All of these ideas are completely foreign to the Toronto Transit Operating System, which is essentially one fare, one operator, and one operator who can't even properly connect the regional transit systems together.
Why?
Well, I think that it's very easy to criticize, frankly, because we haven't had to. We've always had enough money to run it the way we've run it, and because Toronto is the most the Toronto city region is the most localized city region of any big city. We don't have, as in Paris, a government called Grand Paris. Everybody thinks of Paris as being the central area. That's only 2 million people. Grand Paris is 12 million people, and that includes all the suburbs around. And there is one transit authority for that, and that operates in a very, very flexible, imaginative way. London Transport, the same thing. So there actually is a government at the regional city scale in Paris and in London, and to some extent in New York City. We don't have a regional government, and whether we will ever get one is a big political question, but we pay the price for that.
So we had 2 professors from Monk School of Government and the Rotman School of Government come speak to us back, I guess it was more than a year ago, and they were saying that was the problem, and they determined, number one, that Metrolinx / TTC should be combined into one regional transit entity, probably take over all of the peripheral regional transit organizations in York and Peel, et cetera, and that should probably report to some sort of regional government. Is governance the issue?
Yeah, no. I mean, I would subscribe to that, and then I would also take some lessons in the operating style of other city regional transit agencies. What the transit agency should be doing is guaranteeing quality of service, guaranteeing safety, guaranteeing consistency of the offer to the rider. I mean, what's fascinating to me is that you see everybody in the Paris and London transport systems wears the same uniform, which is an immediate message. So there isn't someone wearing a GO uniform and someone wearing a TTC uniform and someone wearing a Mississauga Transit uniform. They're all wearing the same uniform. It's incredible what the messaging of that is. And also they have a Presto card in each of those cities that actually works and saves you money on a unitary system. But then they're very imaginative. Once they've guaranteed that the consumer, the traveler, the commuter is king, after that, how they deliver that service is very, very imaginative. And for the largest part, most of those services in Paris and London and most European cities are delivered by private sector operators under very strong control.
Does that work? The private sector
delivery? It works in the sense that pre-COVID, London Transport made money. So they made enough money. They had actually just taken away all of the operating grants to London Transport just before COVID. Rushed to return them now, obviously, but it's very interesting. The way we do it here is probably the last holdout of an entirely public sector managed and operated system in the world.
But it sounds to me like you're suggesting that we need to go a lot farther in having smaller cars, different classes, lots more amenities, different things that give people the confidence that they're physically distant from other people.
That's right. I mean, I don't know what the package is, and I just was throwing some ideas out in the article, but I don't think we can repeat what we're doing right now. We're going to wake up with the most horrendous financial headache in all our cities and transit agencies next year. And there's, the question is, should we just try and put everything back together again the way it was pre-COVID? One is, I don't think you're going to be able to, because I think the consumer demand for transit will have changed so radically. But also, I don't think we should anyhow. We should use, never fail to make use of a crisis.
Do you really think so? With a vaccine and rapid testing, you don't think we'll just go back to normal
in
I think 6 to 9 months?
I suspect that transit usage has gone the way of e-shopping. E-shopping was increasing steadily, slightly, not very fast, over the past decade. Now it's just gone through the roof. So transit ridership was flat, slightly declining, and now it's just dropped precipitously. I think you'd have to be a very courageous person to think that we're going to get back up onto the same curve we were before. And even that, as I say, was not particularly encouraging, given that things were static.
So the people you're speaking to are members of Transit Alliance. Most of us are in the transit business, either working for companies or associations that want transit and or bid on transit contracts or part of 3P partnerships. Given your fairly negative outlook for transit as it is, what's your recommendation to them?
I think we all, I'm the same way. Our firm bids on a lot of transit projects, and I am a huge believer in finding ways in which we can all move easily and comfortably and environmentally safely around our cities. But I think we'd be nuts not to recognize that something fundamental has happened. And uh, the response to it cannot be just going back to what we were doing before.
And right now, do you think that the TTC and Go Transit are effectively just going back to what we did before?
I think they are doing a fantastic job under unbelievably difficult circumstances, and I have nothing but admiration for the people who work there, and for the line staff who have to cope with situations that frankly are probably putting them at risk in some way, and so I think they are dealing right now with a crisis, and they're dealing with it as best they can. What everybody needs to do, and I suspect it has to be done probably in the chill of the new year, is take a deep breath and say, are we going back to exactly where we were before? Can we go back to exactly where we were before?
And you obviously think not. Let me ask you one last question before I open it up. Sure. In your article, you also, talking about will we go back to the way it was before, comment that you think Main Street retail will do very well because of the desire to go directly into the stores or the restaurants. And you, I think, worry about regional mall type retail. And then you also, and I've got a self-interest in this, comment negatively about major events like sporting events and concerts and things like that. What do you think is going to happen to regional malls versus Main Street, and what's going to happen to major events?
I'll start with the major events. When do we all go to a sporting event again? And probably isn't going to be until sometime in the spring. But at that point, I think that will gather steam, and we'll be back to normal on that. I mean, and partly, without being sort of overly crass, it's because there are a hell of a lot of businesses whose lives depend upon us going to sporting events and concerts, just like there are a hell of a lot of businesses depend on us getting onto an airplane. So I think that will steadily come back. The shopping thing. I mean, it's fascinating. I was just listening to a program last night which said that people used to, on average, people pre-COVID spent about 40% of their food budget on eating outside of their home. That has dropped down to 8%. So I mean, we all know that because nobody's going to restaurants very much, and even the takeout, et cetera, is not being consumed as much as it was. So I think we will see main streets probably coming back to life. The fact is that restaurants are a pretty key driver of main streets. Main streets don't sell anything useful anymore. They sell experience and pleasant shopping and interesting things to do and see. But I suspect they'll come back. And also the other thing, this is where Toronto is an immigrant city. 50% of the people here are not born in Canada. The immigrant way of treating main streets is so energetic and so lively that I think that will frankly keep most of them supported. The interesting comparison is what happened to St. Clair with the putting in the St. Clair LRT. Took 7 years to do it, basically killed the street from a retail point of view. Now, 2 or 3 years after the LRT is in, it is thriving. So there was an awful kind of triage that happened there, but it came back very strong. And I think that main streets are probably going to be okay for the most part. Small, but the shift to e-shopping has been so significant that clearly there's going to be a much lower level of floor space because that demand is gone. And I think we're likely to see smaller malls disappear, which they were doing already. Cloverdale Mall and other Humberview Mall, etc. They were going out of business already. The solid malls are going to be strong, but even they have a problem with where's Neiman Marcus, where's Nordstrom's, where's Indigo. All of these guys have gone. So they're going to have to do a lot of repurposing of a lot of their spaces. So.
Before I turn to everyone else to ask for questions, maybe I could just say a few words about Transit Alliance. Transit Alliance, as I mentioned, is a civic advocacy organization. We've been going for about 8 years now. I've been honored to be on the board for about 6 of them and chair of the board for the last 4 or 5 years. We've got a board of directors and we've got members over 100. At least last year we had members over 100. And we've been challenged by COVID-19 because as lots of different organizations like ours, we have been reliant on people like yourselves, all taking out memberships and then coming to our events. And without in-person events, it's been challenging to attract people to come and pay. We have had 3 virtual meetings now, and we haven't been charging for the virtual meetings, but we still do have some expenses associated with our administrative staff and some of the website maintenance and things like that. So I encourage you, number one, if you have been a member, to consider rejoining up as a member, and if you haven't been a member, to consider joining as a member. And we hope that we'll have in-person events sometime in the future. All of our virtual events we have recorded, and you can get them either on transitalliance.com. And as I mentioned, we've had Ken Greenberg, Jennifer Keesmaat, Phil Verster, people from KPMG in the transit business, including our board member Colin Earp that have presented, and the chief economist at KPMG, which was really quite interesting. So I encourage you to access our materials, hopefully join as a member, and then come out to our events when we go back in real life events again. Maybe I could turn to a couple of questions, and I'll read some of them from the message box, but also I'd love it if some of you want to unmute and maybe in the message box say you're interested in asking a question, and then Joe can get a chance to meet some of you. But first, Joe, Hubert asked, what about the transit systems we are building right now? The Ontario line, for example, we're planning lines like there's no COVID or any aftermath. Is this the right approach?
Well, I think we're building them, so you'd have to be a brave man to say stop building them. And clearly, I think we need to put the system in, particularly Ontario line, the crucial line, to get that in place. Don't misunderstand me. We're still going to need a hard wiring of transit lines. My worry is whether they will be used as much as we anticipated they were going to be used. Which may not be such a terrible thing because the riding conditions under a lot of them were pretty bad, certainly as we know on the Yonge Street line. I'm not saying stop, turn around in terms of the physical projects that we've got commitments to right now. They took so long to get, you'd be nuts to try and wind those up. What I am saying is that I think we need to think about what it is the product that we're offering and the service that we're offering within the system that we've got. And a lot of the experimentation in terms of a different kind of bus delivery system in the suburbs, I think can be done potentially without significant capital investment by the public sector, if one's prepared to consider the private transit franchise idea.
William Denning asked, what is easier for a government to get correct? Either hiring marketing people and allowing consumer-driven transit services, or 2, regulating the quality and pricing of a private service provider. He wonders if it's true consumer-driven transit services, keeping in mind users are not identical to voters.
Yeah, I would like us to veer in terms of a system that is sensitive to the market. Ultimately under public direction, must be under public direction, but a system that's got market feedback loops in it. Do we know whether people would pick up on off-peak fares? If we suddenly said, which is the characteristic of the London transport system, you have a lower fare between 10 o'clock and 3:30 than you do at the rush hour times. What would be the effect on ridership? We have no way of finding that out right now, but it would be a very interesting thing to find out. And given that we are trying to spread the peak of people getting into all those high-rise elevators downtown, this mightn't be a bad idea.
We had another consultant come present to us, I think 2 years ago, that said that the UPX was designed by an engineer. It was designed by a marketer that the stop would have been at Bay Street rather than past Simcoe, and that would have increased ridership dramatically if a businessman could have gone from Bay and King onto the UPX rather than having to walk the several extra blocks that it takes, and said that he thought they just would grab an Uber or a taxi or a limo to the airport rather than walk to past University or York or Simcoe. And then second of all, you'd have two stops at Pearson, one at Terminal 1 and one at Terminal 3. Do you agree with those two comments?
I think that's very sophisticated thinking. I agree. We all know, we've all wheeled our bag, that endless walk. By the way, where there are still not escalators from the subway to the UP Express, you still have to lug your bag upstairs. It's not designed for the kind of fluidity and utter ease and comfort that are part of the decision thinking of people about their life experiences now. I keep coming back to coffee. I mean, you can end up spending $4 or $5 for a coffee. People are doing it. They got to be out of their heads. That's as much, two coffees than you paid for a UP Express fare. And so I think we've got to have some price circuits in there.
We got asked about face-to-face meetings and the importance of face-to-face meetings, and a lot of the things that you've talked about in regards to the death of downtown, or not the death, but the diminution of downtown, suggests that face-to-face meetings and Zoom is okay. What do you think? Are face-to-face meetings important? Are going to come back?
Oh yeah. I mean, the other thing I said in the newspaper article is that who on the call today hasn't had it with Zoom? I mean, seriously. And the reason is because, I'm finding it hard to see your eyes. I can't interact with you. I can't say, oh, they didn't get that. I better make it better. Or, oh my God, they think I'm talking nonsense. There's a whole set of dimensions of face-to-face contact that are so much richer. The other thing is we're human beings. A lot of us like work. We like meeting with people. We love being at home, but we also love what we do, I hope. Certainly in we're working very hard in our firm, about 80 people, but I really worry about the working conditions of a large part of especially of the junior staff who don't know the senior staff very well. We brought on about 15 new people in the last in COVID, and I worry desperately, about the quality of their work life. So no, we human beings are social critters, and being social critters adds to the value and productivity of what we do. And so the office isn't over. The interesting thing on this one is that a lot of the tech guys were saying, everybody can work remotely. Facebook, Google, Microsoft have all three, and a few more have just made huge great pieces of office space in Midtown Manhattan and in central London. So I think we should recognize, and they are very much the drivers of the modern city.
William Denning, do you want to ask your question, sir?
To follow up on the one that you read just now, or
I can't hear.
Go for it.
Alpha Bravo, can you hear me?
Yes.
Just.
Joe, I really do appreciate your point of view on a lot of this stuff, especially on the concept that Toronto has to embrace being a big city. We are a big place, and we have a future as a big place, provided we can step up to it. And I would also argue that Toronto has always done better when it has planned sort of 2 steps ahead of where it is now. In other words, in the early 1950s, when we were a town, we tended to think about what would it be to be a medium-sized city. And now that we're a medium-sized city, I think we should at least be thinking about what would it be to be a large city. That what you need is not so much, the mindset needs to be bigger than it is. And on the other side, on the service delivery side, I completely agree. I've had a lot of experience in private sector delivery of transport options, and that's it can be done. What we don't have is a competence on the provincial and municipal government sides to actively engage and secure the public interest. Part of the problem there municipally is not having a municipality of the region of Toronto. The one that currently bothers me the most is the Eglinton West Crosstown LRT extension, because they're going through a unique, very specialized, very accelerated procurement process to get us the tunnels built. Separately from that, later on, we'll get some procurement of vehicles and stations and signals and all the rest, but a very rapid procurement within the next month, really, of these tunnels. And the Metrolinx evaluation of this before COVID last February showed that this project costs about $5 billion, and the economic impact is negative $3 billion. And politicians at the time said, well, we're not trying to make a profit. That confuses finance and economics. The economic impact is you will shrink the economy of Ontario by $3 billion. Why would we invest $5 to shrink the economy by $3 pre-COVID? Now, the analysis done now would, I suspect, be even worse. So how do we get out of this mindset?
Yeah, I mean, Bill, the real trouble is I don't know. I mean, there are also some wicked problems that are irresolvable. You're never going to have a municipal government of the Greater Toronto Area because it would be 3/4 of the province, and no province in their right mind would ever allow such an entity to grow to that scale, I suspect. And that's just a kind of at birth reality which we who work here have to reckon with.
Eileen, do you want to ask the next question?
Sure. Hi. Thank you.
Hi, Eileen. How are you?
I'm good. How are you? How are you? So great to see you. And I see your sailing map behind you. So
that's right.
Thank you for staying on dry land to come and talk to us. This is a bit of a follow-up to Bill's question because, Bill, I take your point, and I'm an economist, and I get the math of what you've just talked about. But where do we address those non-financial aspects of transit investments and that government should be considering? So, for example, all of those folks who are in precarious roles, who are don't have the choices, even if the choices existed between the Starbucks transit ride and the Tim Hortons transit ride, there are many folks who can't make that choice, don't have the choice, the wherewithal to make the choice. But we need them to get to the jobs that we're asking them to do. And also many of them are doing jobs that many other people won't do. So how do you reflect that in those business case calculations? Because I think that needs to be taken into account.
Well, one of the interesting things that I find fascinating, a little bit the same way with the airplane business, the guys in the front of the plane pay for everybody in the back. Mm-hmm. The transit ridership premiums on the intercity rail in England, which is basically anything over an hour or so, you're paying 3 or 4 times as much for your seat as the guys are who are on a premium price ticket. So don't assume that a 2-class system assumes that the less expensive ride or assume that less expensive ride is probably getting subsidized by the front of the bus. And that's the kind of math which nobody has ever dreamt of doing. I don't know how. It's also tricky to know as a practical matter how you would do that on a GO train or certainly on a TTC vehicle. But it is the kind of thing we need to think about. And I would love it on the Lakeshore West and Lakeshore East line if we built a system, which I don't think is impossible to do, where you could go from Hamilton to Oakville to Port Credit to Toronto, three stops, 2 stops. And you ought to be able to do that in about 45 minutes. You can't imagine the ridership you would get from that, because now it's a very laborious journey and stopping every 10 minutes. So that it's that kind of thinking that, and on that you could charge a lot of money for.
You know, I got to tell you, I am a frequent user of the Long Island Railway in Long Island, and there is an express from Penn Station to Southampton. Only runs on the weekends and only in the summer, but it's an express the whole way out, and you get a drink as you enter into the car, or at least drinks are available. And it's packed crowded, so it's certainly not first class, but I got to tell you, it's packed crowded because it's very attractive to skip by probably 30 stations on the way to Southampton.
Yep. Nice place.
Any other
to go.
questions? Anyone else wanting to ask a question?
The comment I had for Eileen was transportation always has two dimensions. There's a side of it which is a necessity. There's a minimum level of access and mobility that's a public good and should be available to everybody at some price. And that's a regulatory issue of where's that standard that we assume. It's like elementary and secondary education, you don't pay separately to go to those schools. But then there's a huge proportion of transportation which is commercially, could be in a commercial regime. And that's exactly what Joe's talking about. So once you set up your base standard parliamentary trains of the 1850s, above that standard, you should be applying commercial logic.
Fair enough. And I think what Joe is also saying is that the network elements of the network and the product offering and the spectrum of different prices could be used to cross-subsidize each other. So you don't have to worry about that TTC transit ride because it actually is being paid for another product elsewhere in the system.
Yeah, I mean, that's already happening. You know, obviously, the Toronto Transit Commission, not every bus route is equally profitable, but every bus route charges you the same fare. You know, there are all kinds of tricks that one could get into, I think, there in terms of differential pricing, distance pricing, and other things. And again, one of the joys about the Presto card, I sincerely hope it's not been the most encouraging piece of technology we've ever acquired, but I hope that it's capable of managing this kind of imaginative pricing.
Joe, maybe I can ask you one last question. What's your vision long-term if you were Premier of Ontario or Minister of Transportation or the Czar for transit in the GTA? What's the one big change in the next 5 years you'd love to put in place?
Well, there are two related changes. First is I would love to see there being all transit being the responsibility of one agency, and that there be one uniform worn by every transit operator from St. Catharines to Oshawa. After then, and that agency would be responsible for all, for the Presto card, for the receipt of all fare revenues, and it would then, within very strong guidelines, commission individual parts of the system.
I'm on a call. Sorry.
Yeah, commission the individual parts of the system to operate in the most efficient, effective way possible. And that would sometimes involve private sector operators, sometimes not. But it's a little bit like with the garbage collection in Toronto. I love the idea of having half the city privately collected, half the city publicly collected. We need to start doing that in transit as well.
Well, thank you very much, everyone, for joining us today on the Transit Alliance session. And Joe Berridge, thank you so much for being our speaker today. I really appreciate it.
Lots of familiar faces, so nice to see.
Thank you. And maybe I could give one last pitch again. If you're at all interested, please come to transitalliance.com and join up as a member, or at minimum sign up for our newsletter so that you can get all of our announcements of future upcoming events. And this session has been recorded, and we will be putting it on 9:60 a.m. Probably in about 2 weeks, or I'll be posting it in Transit Alliance. I'll be posting it so you can listen to it again. And by the way, I've got this nightly radio show where I've interviewed a whole bunch of different people on transit and a whole bunch of other topics. So feel free to take a look, and you can see those on briancrombie.com. Joe Berridge, thank you so much.
My pleasure. Have a good evening.
Thanks, everyone, for joining.
Bye, Brian. Have a good night.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, Brian.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you. It's interesting seeing all the people.
Haven't seen you in a while, Brian. That was really great.
Thanks, Saba. How are you doing?
I'm good. I missed you. It's been a long time.
We got to get someone for November. Any ideas?
Yeah.
Let me know.
I'm in trial in November. I'm really, really swamped. Things are going to ease up for me in mid-December.
Okay. Well, let me know if you've got any great ideas.
Yeah, will do.
Okay. Thanks so much.
Take
Good
care.
night. Bye-bye.
Bye.